Before we begin, happy holidays to everyone listening. Whether you're spending time with family, travelling, or just enjoying some downtime with a mystery story, we're grateful you're here. A huge thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this story. We love hearing your ideas, and this one is absolutely perfect for the channel. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us. And if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that refuse to stay buried, hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get into tonight's story. There are certain minds throughout history that seem to exist outside the boundaries of their own time. Individuals whose understanding of the world appears so advanced, so impossibly ahead of their contemporaries, that we're left with an uncomfortable question. How? Leonardo da Vinci is perhaps the most striking example. A man born in the middle of the 15th century who sketched helicopters, who designed submarines, who understood human anatomy with a precision that wouldn't be matched for 300 years, who wrote in mirror image as if deliberately hiding something, who kept thousands of pages of notes that he never published, never shared, and in many cases never even explained. The traditional narrative tells us he was simply a genius, a once-in-a-millennium mind. But what if that's not the whole story? What if Leonardo wasn't inventing these ideas at all? What if he was preserving them, recording knowledge that came from somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere we're not supposed to know about? Tonight we're going to explore a possibility that historians have quietly debated for centuries. That Leonardo da Vinci didn't just happen to be brilliant, that he had access to something. Knowledge that predated him by hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. Information that was never meant to see the light of day. This is the story of the man who knew too much. Chapter 1. The Historical Leonardo. To understand the conspiracy, we first need to understand the man. Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci was born on April 15th in the year 1452, in the small Tuscan hill town of Vinci, in what was then the Republic of Florence. He was the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman. His birth circumstances meant he couldn't follow in his father's footsteps into the legal profession. He couldn't attend university. He was, by the standards of his time, an outsider from the beginning. And yet, this outsider would become one of the most influential figures in human history. Leonardo was largely self-educated. He learned through observation, through apprenticeship, through his own relentless curiosity about how the world worked. At 14, he entered the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence, one of the leading artists of the Renaissance. There he learned painting, sculpture, metalworking, and the technical arts. But Leonardo's interest went far beyond art. He studied anatomy by dissecting corpses. He designed war machines for the Duke of Milan. He created elaborate stage sets for court performances. He investigated the nature of light, water, geology, and flight. He was an artist, yes, but also an engineer, an anatomist, an architect, a mathematician, a physicist before physics had a name, and he documented everything. Leonardo kept notebooks, thousands of pages of them, dense, meticulous records of his observations, sketches, theories, and designs. These weren't journals in the traditional sense. They were repositories of knowledge, technical manuals for inventions that wouldn't exist for centuries, anatomical studies that rivaled modern medical textbooks, mathematical proofs, engineering schematics, all recorded in his distinctive mirror writing flowing from right to left across the page. During his lifetime, almost none of this was published. Almost none of it was shared. Leonardo worked on commission for wealthy patrons. He painted, he built, he advised. But the contents of his notebooks, those remained private. The question is why? Why would someone with such groundbreaking insights keep them hidden? Why would a man who could have revolutionized medicine, engineering, and physics choose instead to lock his knowledge away in coded script? The official answer is simple. Leonardo was a perfectionist. He rarely finished projects. He moved from obsession to obsession. He planned to publish his findings eventually, but ran out of time. But there's another possibility, one that's far more unsettling. What if Leonardo was protecting something? What if he understood that the knowledge he possessed was dangerous, that it came from a source he couldn't publicly acknowledge? Chapter 2. The notebooks that were never meant to be read. Let's talk about the mirror writing. If you've ever seen a page from Leonardo's notebooks, you know what I'm talking about. Every word written backwards, readable only when held up to a mirror, thousands upon thousands of pages, all in this reverse script. The standard explanation is that Leonardo was left-handed, and mirror writing was simply more convenient for him. It prevented smudging, it felt more natural, nothing sinister about it. But consider this, Leonardo could write normally when he wanted to, letters to patrons, official correspondence, public-facing documents, all written in standard left-to-right script. He had the ability. He chose not to use it for his private work. Why deliberately make your own notes harder to read? The conspiracy theory suggests that Leonardo was encoding his knowledge, making it inaccessible to casual observers, ensuring that only someone with intent, with time, with purpose could decipher what he'd written. This wasn't convenience, it was concealment. And when you look at what those notebooks contain, the idea of concealment starts to make sense. Leonardo's notebooks include designs for a helicopter-like aerial screw that uses rotating blades to achieve lift. This is 400 years before the Wright brothers would achieve powered flight. An armoured vehicle, essentially a tank with a protective shell and rotating cannons. This concept wouldn't be realised until World War I. A submarine, a diving suit, underwater breathing apparatus, all sketched in detail with notes on how they might function. Parachutes, ball bearings, hydraulic pumps, machines for excavating canals, weapons of war that resemble modern artillery. These aren't vague ideas, they're technical blueprints, many of them functional, many of them buildable even with Renaissance technology, had anyone understood what they were looking at. But here's what's truly strange. Leonardo never built most of these devices himself, never tested them, never promoted them. He drew them, made notes about them, and then moved on. It's as if he was cataloguing something, recording information for future reference. Not inventing, but documenting, preserving knowledge that already existed somewhere else. Now, let's get specific. In the Codex Atlanticus, there's a page, folio 308 recto, that shows a design for what Leonardo called a self-propelled cart. It's essentially an automobile, spring-driven, with steering mechanisms and braking systems. Modern engineers at the Museum of the History of Science in Florence actually built this design. It worked. Perfectly. A car in the year 1500. How did Leonardo know the precise ratios needed for the gears? How did he understand the mechanics of energy storage and release? This wasn't guesswork. The mathematics are exact. On folio 860 verso of the same codex, there's a design for ball bearings, spheres captured between two rings to reduce friction. This concept wouldn't appear in patent offices until the 1700s, 2 centuries after Leonardo drew it. He didn't just sketch these devices, he understood the physics, the engineering principles, the materials needed. It's as if he had a textbook from the future sitting in front of him. Chapter 3. Forbidden Anatomy. In Leonardo's time, the human body was a mystery. Medical knowledge was based largely on the writings of ancient Greek physicians like Galen, who had worked over 1,000 years earlier. Actual human dissection was rare, controversial, and in many cases forbidden by the Church. Leonardo didn't care. Between the late 1480s and 1511, Leonardo dissected approximately 30 human corpses. He did this in secret, often at night, working by candlelight in morgues and hospitals. The bodies were criminals, paupers, people who wouldn't be missed. Leonardo would spend hours, sometimes days, carefully opening them up, studying their inner workings, and sketching what he found. The results were extraordinary. Leonardo's anatomical drawings are so accurate that they're still used in medical education today. His sketches of the human heart show the chambers, the valves, the vessels with photographic precision. His studies of the spine reveal details about vertebrae and muscle attachments that weren't officially documented until the 19th century. His drawings of a fetus in the womb are so detailed, so correct, that they look like they could have come from a modern ultrasound. How? How does someone with no formal medical training working with rudimentary tools achieve this level of understanding? The official story is that Leonardo was simply that observant, that meticulous, that brilliant. But there's another interpretation. What if Leonardo already knew what he was supposed to find? What if he wasn't discovering the structure of the human body but confirming it, comparing what he saw on the dissection table with knowledge he'd acquired elsewhere? Some researchers have suggested that Leonardo may have had access to lost medical texts, ancient manuscripts from Egypt, Greece, or the Middle East that contained anatomical knowledge more advanced than what was publicly available in Renaissance Europe. These texts might have been suppressed, hidden away in private collections or monastery libraries, accessible only to those with the right connections. Leonardo had connections, wealthy patrons, powerful friends, access to libraries and scholars across Italy and France. If there were forbidden texts circulating in underground intellectual networks, Leonardo would have been in a position to see them. And if those texts revealed truths about the human body that contradicted church doctrine, well, you'd keep that to yourself, wouldn't you? You'd verify it quietly, record it in mirror writing, and never speak of it publicly, because the alternative would be heresy, prosecution, possibly death. Let's examine a specific example. In the Royal Collection at Windsor Castle, there's a series of drawings Leonardo made around 1510 showing the heart and its blood vessels. What's remarkable is that Leonardo correctly identified the aortic valve and understood its function in preventing backflow. He even noted that the valve has 3 cusps, not 2 as Galen had claimed. But here's the thing, Leonardo couldn't have observed this just by dissection. The heart stops beating when someone dies. The blood drains. You can't see the valve in action. You can't watch it open and close. Yet Leonardo drew it functioning. He understood the hydraulics of blood flow through a living heart. How? Modern researchers suggest he may have used glass models, filling them with water to observe flow patterns. That's possible. But it doesn't explain how he knew what pattern to expect in the first place. How he knew to build the model with 3 cusps instead of 2. How he knew the precise shape and angle needed for the valve to function. Unless he'd read about it somewhere. Unless someone, sometime, had documented this before. Chapter 4. The Missing Years. Here's where things get interesting. Leonardo's biography has gaps. Significant periods where we have little to no documentation of where he was or what he was doing. Historians have attempted to fill these gaps with educated guesses, but the truth is, we don't know. For example, between 1476 and 1478, Leonardo essentially disappears from the historical record. He's no longer listed in Verrocchio's workshop. He hasn't yet established his own studio. Where was he? What was he doing? Again in 1482 there's a gap. Leonardo is supposed to be in Milan, but documentation is thin. Letters are missing, commissions are vague, and then there are the unexplained trips. Leonardo travelled extensively throughout Italy and France. Some of these journeys are well documented, others are mysteries. Why did he go to certain cities? Who did he meet with? What was he studying? The conspiracy theory suggests that these missing years weren't empty at all, that Leonardo was working on classified projects, commissions from secret patrons who couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Or perhaps he was travelling to access restricted libraries, meeting with members of hidden societies, learning from sources that history has conveniently forgotten. Consider this. During these gaps, Leonardo's style and knowledge seem to shift. He returns from these periods with new techniques, new ideas, sudden leaps in a understanding that can't easily be explained by gradual development. It's as if he went somewhere and learned something. But what? And from whom? There's a curious detail in one of Leonardo's notebooks, the Codex Arundel, page 270. It's a list of books Leonardo wanted to acquire or had read. Among the titles are several works that shouldn't have been available in Renaissance Italy. Byzantine texts, Arabic treatises on optics and mathematics, books that were supposedly lost when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. How did Leonardo even know these books existed? How did he get access to them? One possibility is the Medici Library in Florence. The Medici family had agents throughout the Mediterranean. constantly searching for ancient manuscripts. They recovered texts from monasteries, private collections, even looted them from conquered cities. The library was vast, containing thousands of works, many of them never catalogued, never made public. Leonardo had connections to the Medici. He worked for them on and off throughout his career. He would have had access. But there's another possibility, one that takes us into darker territory. What if Leonardo was part of a network? A chain of knowledge keepers who passed information from generation to generation, preserving ancient wisdom that was too dangerous to publish openly. Chapter 5. The Art That Speaks in Symbols. Leonardo's paintings are among the most analysed artworks in human history, and for good reason. They're not just beautiful, they're strange, filled with anomalies, hidden details, and symbolic elements that have puzzled scholars for centuries. Take The Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 1498, on the wall of a monastery dining hall in Milan. On the surface, it's a straightforward depiction of Jesus and his 12 apostles at the moment Christ announces that one of them will betray him. But look closer. The composition is built on precise mathematical proportions. The perspective lines converge exactly on Christ's head. The spacing of the figures follows geometric patterns that wouldn't be formalised in art theory for another 100 years. Some researchers claim to have found musical notation hidden in the positions of the bread and hands of the apostles. Play it back, and you get a brief, haunting melody. Then there's the figure to Christ's right. Traditionally identified as John the Apostle, this figure has soft features, long hair, and a distinctly feminine appearance. This has spawned countless theories, most famously the idea popularised by modern conspiracy theorists that this is actually Mary Magdalene, and that Leonardo was encoding a secret about Christ's marriage and bloodline. Whether or not you believe that specific theory, the question remains, why paint John this way? Why introduce ambiguity into a scene that should be theologically clear? Unless the ambiguity was the point. Unless Leonardo was deliberately leaving clues, breadcrumbs for those who knew how to look. But let's go deeper. Let's talk about something most people don't notice. In The Last Supper there are exactly 13 loaves of bread visible on the table. Not 12. 13. In Christian symbolism, 12 represents the apostles. 13 represents betrayal, bad luck, the number of people at the table including Judas. But here's the thing. There are also 13 figures in the painting. Christ and 12 apostles. So why 13 loaves? Why the duplication? Some researchers believe Leonardo was encoding a double meaning, that he was suggesting there were 13 initiates, not 12, that someone at that table wasn't who they appeared to be, that the traditional story is incomplete. Then there's the positioning of the hands. Every figure in The Last Supper has their hands visible except for one. There's a hand reaching toward a bread roll that doesn't clearly belong to any figure. It's disembodied. Anonymous. Whose hand is it? Why is it there? Leonardo was obsessive about detail. He wouldn't make a mistake like this, which means it's intentional, a symbol, a message. Now let's talk about the Mona Lisa, painted sometime between 1503 and 1506, the most famous painting in the world, and one of the most mysterious. Who is she? The official identification is Lisa Gherardini, wife of a Florentine merchant. But Leonardo never delivered the painting to whoever commissioned it. He kept it with him for the rest of his life, continuously working on it, refining it, never considering it finished. Why? The painting is full of oddities. The background landscapes on the left and right don't match. They're at different elevations, as if depicting two different worlds. The smile is famously ambiguous. The eyes seem to follow you. The entire composition has an otherworldly quality, as if the subject exists outside of normal time and space. Some theorists believe the Mona Lisa is a self-portrait, Leonardo in feminine form, a meditation on duality, hidden identity, the fluidity of self. Others think it's a coded representation of esoteric knowledge, the landscape symbolising the hermetic principle of as above, so below, the smile representing hidden wisdom, accessible only to initiates. But here's something most people don't know. In 2005, researchers at the University of Amsterdam used digital analysis to examine the Mona Lisa's eyes. They found tiny letters and numbers painted in the pupils. In the right eye, the letters V, Leonardo Vinci, his signature, hidden where no one would look. But in the left eye, different symbols, possibly the letters C, E or B, or numbers. The resolution isn't clear enough to say for certain. Why hide symbols in the eyes of your subject? What message are you encoding? And it doesn't stop there. Analysis of the painting using infrared and ultraviolet light has revealed that Leonardo painted, erased, and repainted sections multiple times. There are layers beneath the visible surface, earlier versions of the face, different expressions, different details. It's as if he was trying to get something exactly right, capture something specific, encode something that could only be understood by someone who knew what to look for. What we know for certain is this: Leonardo treated this painting differently than any of his other works. He guarded it, obsessed over it, refused to let it go. That suggests it meant something more to him than just another commission. It was personal, it was important, it was a message. Chapter 6: Leonardo and Secret Societies. Renaissance Italy was a cauldron of intellectual ferment. This was the age of rediscovery. Ancient Greek and Roman texts were being translated and distributed. Hermetic philosophy, astrology, alchemy and mysticism were all experiencing a revival. Scholars were asking dangerous questions about the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos and humanity's place in it. And they were doing it quietly, because the church was watching. Secret societies weren't exactly secret, but they were discreet. Groups of intellectuals, artists and nobles who met to discuss ideas that couldn't be spoken about publicly. Proto-Masonic organisations, hermetic circles, alchemical fraternities. These groups preserved and transmitted knowledge that was considered heretical or dangerous. Did Leonardo have connections to these networks? There's no smoking gun, no membership roster with his name on it, but there are suggestions, coincidences, overlaps. Leonardo's patron in Milan, Ludovico Sforza, was known to support esoteric scholars. The Medici family in Florence, who also employed Leonardo, had extensive libraries filled with hermetic and alchemical texts. Leonardo moved in these circles. He had access, and his notebooks contain references to concepts that align with hermetic philosophy. The idea of microcosm and macrocosm, the interconnectedness of all things, the belief that nature operates according to hidden mathematical laws that, if understood, could unlock tremendous power. Leonardo once wrote, "Learn how to see, realise that everything connects to everything else." That's not just artistic philosophy, that's hermetic doctrine. But let's get specific. There's a group that historians know existed in 15th century Florence called the Platonic Academy. Founded by Cosimo de' Medici and led by the philosopher Marsilio Ficino, this academy was dedicated to studying and translating ancient Greek texts, particularly the works of Plato and the Hermetic Corpus. The Hermetic Corpus is a collection of writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure believed to have lived in ancient Egypt and possessed divine knowledge. These texts discuss alchemy, astrology, and the hidden structure of the universe. They were rediscovered in the West in the mid-1400s and caused a sensation among intellectuals. Leonardo lived in Florence during the height of the Platonic Academy's influence. He worked for the Medici. He knew Ficino and other Academy members. It's virtually impossible that he wasn't exposed to Hermetic ideas. But there's more. In Leonardo's notebooks there are sketches and diagrams that appear to be alchemical symbols. Circles within circles, geometric patterns, arrangements of elements that match known alchemical texts. On page 76, recto of the Codex Atlanticus, there's a drawing of a square inside a circle inside a triangle. This is a classic Hermetic symbol representing the relationship between earth, heaven, and divine fire. It's not just decorative. Leonardo has notes around it discussing proportions and ratios, as if he's using the symbol as a mathematical tool. Why would an artist and engineer be studying alchemical geometry unless he believed it had practical applications? Then there's the matter of the Vitruvian Man. one of Leonardo's most famous drawings. Created around 1490, it shows a male figure in two superimposed positions, arms and legs outstretched, inscribed within both a circle and a square. The official explanation is that Leonardo was illustrating the proportions of the human body as described by the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius. The drawing demonstrates that the human form embodies perfect mathematical ratios, but Hermetic scholars see something else. The Vitruvian man is a representation of the Hermetic principle that humans are microcosms of the universe, that the same proportions that govern the human body govern the cosmos, that by understanding ourselves we understand reality itself. Leonardo even wrote on the drawing, "Man is the model of the world." That's pure Hermetic philosophy, the idea that humanity contains within itself the keys to universal knowledge. Some researchers have suggested that Leonardo was part of a chain of knowledge transmission, that he was taught by someone who was taught by someone, going back through the centuries, preserving ancient wisdom that predated Christianity itself, Egyptian mysteries, Greek philosophy, Babylonian astronomy, knowledge that had been driven underground but never truly lost. If that's true, then Leonardo wasn't a lone genius. He was a guardian, a keeper of secrets, someone entrusted with preserving information until humanity was ready to receive it. But of course humanity might never be ready, and so the knowledge stays hidden, encoded in art, buried in notebooks, waiting. There's even a theory that connects Leonardo to the Knights Templar. The Templars were a medieval military order that operated during the Crusades. They were suppressed by the Church in the early 1300s, accused of heresy and devil worship. Most were arrested and executed, but legends persist that some escaped, taking with them vast treasures and secret knowledge they'd acquired in the Holy Land. Could that knowledge have been passed down through secret societies to Renaissance scholars like Leonardo? It's speculative, but consider this. The Templars were known to have extensive libraries. They had access to Arabic and Byzantine texts. They studied sacred geometry and architectural principles that they incorporated into their churches and castles. When the Templars were destroyed, their knowledge didn't just vanish. It went somewhere. Into hiding. Into networks of initiates who would preserve it across the centuries. Could Leonardo have been part of that chain? Could his notebooks contain fragments of Templar wisdom, encoded and hidden, waiting to be decoded by someone who understood the symbols? Chapter 7. Technology too early. Let's return to those inventions, the flying machines, the tanks, the submarines. These designs weren't fantasies. Modern engineers have built working models based on Leonardo's sketches, and many of them function exactly as he predicted. The aerial screw generates lift. The armoured vehicle moves and protects its occupants. The diving suit allows underwater exploration. Leonardo understood principles of aerodynamics, hydraulics, and mechanical engineering that wouldn't be formally articulated until the Industrial Revolution, 300 years after his death. How? The standard answer: observation and experimentation. Leonardo studied birds to understand flight. He watched water wheels to grasp hydraulic power. He was a keen observer of nature, and he extrapolated from what he saw. But here's the problem with that explanation. Leonardo didn't just observe nature and make educated guesses. He understood the underlying mathematics, the ratios, the force calculations, the material stresses. This wasn't trial and error. This was applied physics, and he was doing it centuries before Newton formalized the laws of motion, before Bernoulli explained fluid dynamics, before anyone had a theoretical framework for understanding how these machines should work. So where did that framework come from? The conspiracy theory suggests reverse engineering, that Leonardo had access to descriptions or even diagrams of technologies from an earlier, more advanced civilization. Perhaps ancient texts from Alexandria before the library burned. Perhaps artifacts recovered from archaeological sites. Perhaps oral traditions passed down through secret societies. He wasn't inventing, he was reconstructing, taking fragmentary knowledge and trying to rebuild lost technologies. That would explain why so many of his designs were never built during his lifetime. He didn't have all the pieces. He was working from incomplete information, trying to fill in the gaps. Recording what he knew, hoping that future generations might finish what he started. It would also explain the secrecy. If Leonardo had stumbled upon evidence of an advanced prehistoric civilization, that would be profoundly dangerous. It would undermine the Church's timeline of human history. It would suggest that progress wasn't linear, that humanity had risen and fallen before, that the Renaissance wasn't a rebirth but a re-remembering. You don't publish that kind of revelation. You hide it, you encode it, and you hope someone in the future will understand. Let's examine a specific case. In the Codex Madrid, discovered in the Spanish National Library in 1967, there's a design for what Leonardo called a clockwork knight. It's a humanoid automaton, powered by springs and gears, capable of sitting, standing, moving its arms, and even moving its jaw. Modern roboticists at the Institute and Museum of the History of Science in Florence built this design. It worked. A functional robot, designed 500 years before the word robot was even invented. Leonardo didn't just draw this. He understood kinematics, the study of motion. He knew about gear ratios, mechanical advantage, and energy storage. These concepts weren't formalized until the 17th and 18th centuries. How did a Renaissance artist know robotics? Unless he didn't invent it. Unless he was copying it from something older. There's a legend, mostly dismissed by mainstream historians, that during the Crusades, European knights encountered ancient automata in the Middle East. Mechanical devices left over from Greek and Roman times, or possibly even older. These automata supposedly demonstrated technological sophistication that medieval Europeans couldn't explain. Some of these devices might have been brought back to Europe, studied, documented, and then, when the Church cracked down on anything that smacked of pagan or heretical knowledge, hidden away. Could Leonardo have seen one of these ancient machines? Could he have studied it, taken it apart, and recorded how it worked? It's impossible to prove, but it would explain a lot. Then there's the matter of Leonardo's flying machines. He designed several different types. The aerial screw, which resembles a helicopter, an ornithopter with flapping wings, a glider with fixed wings. Each design shows sophisticated understanding of aerodynamic principles. Leonardo filled pages with calculations about lift, drag, and weight ratios. He understood that you needed a certain wing area to support a certain mass. He knew about the relationship between air pressure and altitude. He even speculated about something resembling jet propulsion, though he couldn't build it with available technology. This is centuries before the Bernoulli principle would explain how wings generate lift, before anyone understood the physics of flight. Leonardo wrote in his notebooks, "A bird is an instrument working according to mathematical law. It lies within the power of man to reproduce this instrument with all its movements." He didn't say, "I am inventing flight." He said, "reproduce," as if flight had existed before, as if he was recreating something that had been lost. What if ancient civilizations had achieved flight? What if there were texts, legends, or artifacts that described or depicted flying machines, and Leonardo had access to them? It sounds far-fetched. But ancient Sanskrit texts from India describe vimanas, flying vehicles used by gods and kings. These descriptions are detailed, mentioning propulsion systems, navigation, and even weapons. Mainstream scholars dismiss these as mythology, but what if they weren't entirely fictional? What if they preserved memories of real technologies, distorted by time but containing kernels of truth? Leonardo had access to the Medici library, which contained texts from across the ancient world. He could read Latin and some Greek. He had contacts with scholars who translated Arabic and Sanskrit manuscripts. If descriptions of ancient flying machines existed anywhere in Europe, Leonardo might have found them. And if he did, he would have done exactly what his notebooks show, tried to figure out how they worked, tried to rebuild them, tried to preserve that knowledge for the future. Chapter 8. The knowledge he never released. Here's one of the most puzzling aspects of Leonardo's life: his refusal to finish things. He started more projects than he completed. Paintings left unfinished, sculptures abandoned, engineering designs sketched but never built, anatomical treatises planned but never compiled. and crucially, he never published his notebooks. During the Renaissance, the printing press was revolutionizing information distribution. Books were being produced and circulated at an unprecedented rate. If Leonardo had wanted to share his knowledge, he could have. He could have become one of the most influential scientific authors of his age, but he didn't. Even when opportunities presented themselves, even when patrons encouraged him, even when scholars begged for access to his findings, Leonardo held back. He made excuses, promised future publications that never materialized, kept his notebooks private. Why? The conspiracy theory offers a chilling explanation. Leonardo feared what would happen if his knowledge fell into the wrong hands. Look at the military technologies he designed. Weapons of incredible destructive power. Machines that could change the nature of warfare. If these had been built and deployed during the constant conflicts of Renaissance Italy, the devastation would have been catastrophic. Leonardo may have realized this. He may have understood that humanity wasn't ready, that the knowledge he possessed, while fascinating, was also dangerous, that it needed to be preserved for the future but kept away from the present. There's evidence to support this. In his notebooks, Leonardo writes about his reluctance to publish certain findings. He expresses concern about how his inventions might be used. He notes that some knowledge should be withheld for the benefit of mankind. This isn't the attitude of someone who just never got around to finishing things. This is deliberate restraint, conscious suppression. Leonardo was sitting on a powder keg of revolutionary ideas, and he chose not to light the fuse. The question is, did he make that choice alone? Or was he following instructions? Adhering to the rules of some organization or tradition that demanded knowledge be parcelled out slowly, carefully, only when the time was right? In the Codex Leicester, Leonardo writes about a discovery he made regarding fossils and geological formations. He understood that fossil seashells found on mountaintops meant those mountains had once been underwater. He understood geological time, the idea that the Earth was millions of years old, not thousands as the Church taught. This was heretical, dangerous. If Leonardo had published this, he would have been accused of contradicting Scripture. But instead of keeping silent, instead of destroying this knowledge, Leonardo recorded it, preserved it, in mirror writing, for someone in the future to find. He wrote, "The number of years during which the Mediterranean was being formed is to be seen in the thickness of the sediments, which could not have been deposited in less time. That's geology. That's deep time. That's a complete rejection of biblical chronology. And Leonardo knew it. He even wrote, almost apologetically, 'Here there is room for more extended discourse, but the brevity to which I am constrained prevents me.' Translation: I have more to say, but I can't. Not now, not safely." This pattern repeats throughout Leonardo's notebooks. Revolutionary insights, followed by hesitation. Bold claims, followed by restraint. As if he's constantly aware that he's walking a tightrope between preserving truth and protecting himself. It suggests Leonardo as part of something bigger, that he understood his role as a keeper of knowledge, not a disseminator, that there were rules about what could be shared and what had to remain hidden, and those rules may have come from a tradition much older than Leonardo himself. Chapter 9: Death and Disappearance. Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2nd, 1519 in Amboise, France. He was 67 years old. He spent his final years in the service of King Francis I of France, living in a manor house called Clos Lucé, still working, still sketching, still pursuing the mysteries that had consumed his life. According to legend, Leonardo died in the arms of the king, though historians doubt this actually happened. What we know for certain is that he was failing for months before his death. His right hand was partially paralysed, possibly from a stroke. He could still draw and write with his left hand, but he knew his time was running out. In his final months, Leonardo destroyed some of his papers, burned them. Why? What did they contain that even he, on his deathbed, felt needed to be erased? When he died, he left behind thousands of pages of notebooks, but not all of them survived. His heir was Francesco Melzi, a devoted pupil who had worked with Leonardo for years. Melzi inherited the notebooks and took them back to Italy, where he attempted to organise them. perhaps prepare them for publication. But Melzi died in 1570, and after that the notebooks were scattered. Some were sold, some were stolen. Some were divided up among heirs who had no idea what they possessed. Pages were torn out. Entire volumes disappeared. Today we have perhaps half of what Leonardo originally created. Maybe less. The Codex Leicester, the Codex Atlanticus, the Windsor collection. These are the survivors, precious fragments of a much larger whole. But what about the rest? Where did those missing notebooks go? What did they contain? The conspiracy theory suggests that certain volumes were deliberately suppressed, that someone at some point recognised the dangerous knowledge they contained and removed them from circulation. Perhaps the church confiscated them. Perhaps a secret society reclaimed them. Perhaps they were destroyed. Or perhaps they're still out there, hidden in private collections, locked in vaults, waiting to be rediscovered. There are persistent rumours of lost Leonardo manuscripts. In the 1960s, 2 volumes of Leonardo's notebooks were discovered in the National Library of Spain. They'd been there for centuries, miscatalogued and forgotten. This discovery proved that major Leonardo works could remain hidden in plain sight for hundreds of years. If 2 volumes could hide in a public library, what might be concealed in private hands? There are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, of a Leonardo manuscript in the library of a German noble family, of pages supposedly held by the Vatican, never displayed, never catalogued, of a volume allegedly in the possession of a British collector who refuses to let anyone examine it. Are these real, or just wishful thinking? We don't know. But the fact remains, a significant portion of Leonardo's work is missing, and given the explosive nature of what we do have, it's worth asking what secrets might be in what we don't. Consider this. The notebooks that survived are the ones that were inherited by students, sold to collectors, eventually donated to libraries and museums. They're the public-facing notebooks, the ones Leonardo might have expected others to see. But what about his private notebooks, the ones he kept truly secret, the ones that contained his most dangerous ideas? If Leonardo was part of a knowledge-keeping tradition, if he had access to forbidden texts and ancient wisdom, he wouldn't have recorded that in notebooks he planned to pass on to students. He would have kept separate records, hidden records, accessible only to those who knew where to look, and when he died, those records would have been retrieved, not by his heirs, by others, by members of whatever organisation Leonardo served. That's speculation, but it fits the evidence. It explains why major gaps exist in Leonardo's work. It explains why certain topics he clearly studied, based on scattered notes and comments, have no dedicated treatises. It explains the pattern of suppression and concealment that runs through his entire life. Leonardo took secrets to his grave, but some of those secrets may not have died with him. They may have been passed on, quietly, through channels we can't trace. Chapter 10. Why the truth would be dangerous. Let's step back and consider what's at stake here. If Leonardo da Vinci really did have access to ancient advanced knowledge, the implications are staggering. First, it would mean that human history isn't what we think it is, that there were civilizations before ours, possibly far before, that achieved levels of sophistication we're only now beginning to match, that history is cyclical, not linear, that we've been here before. This idea terrifies institutions. It undermines narratives of progress. It suggests that everything we've built could collapse, just as it has before, that we're not ascending towards some inevitable enlightenment, but cycling through patterns of rise and fall that stretch back into prehistory. The Church, during Leonardo's time and for centuries after, insisted on a specific timeline. Creation occurred roughly 4,000 years before Christ. Human history was short, recent, and centred on biblical events. Anything that contradicted this was heresy. If Leonardo had evidence of ancient advanced civilizations that predated biblical chronology, he couldn't say so. Not publicly. The Inquisition was real. People were burned for less. Second, it would mean that institutions we trust, religious and secular, have been hiding this truth. That the story we're told about human development, progress, the rise of civilization is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Think about what mainstream history teaches. Humans evolved slowly. Civilization began in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago. Progress has been gradual, building on previous generations, leading inexorably to our current state of development. But what if that's wrong? What if there were earlier civilizations that rose to great heights, then collapsed catastrophically? What if knowledge was lost in those collapses, only to be partially recovered later? What if Leonardo had access to fragments of that lost knowledge? It would mean that human potential is far greater than we've been told, that our ancestors were capable of things we don't give them credit for, that the ancient world wasn't primitive but sophisticated in ways we're only beginning to understand. And that raises uncomfortable questions. If ancient civilizations were advanced, why did they fall? What mistakes did they make? Are we making the same mistakes now? Third, it would mean that there are people, groups, organizations who have known this truth and chosen to keep it secret for centuries, perhaps millennia, controlling what we know, when we know it, ensuring that the masses remain ignorant while the initiated preserve the real knowledge. This is the part that really unsettles people, the idea that history is managed, that knowledge is rationed, that there's an elite class of keepers who decide what humanity gets to know and when. If Leonardo was part of such a group, he was following their rules, recording information but not releasing it, preserving knowledge for future generations while keeping it hidden from his own. Why would anyone do that? The benevolent interpretation is that they're protecting humanity. That knowledge can be dangerous if released at the wrong time, that societies need to be ready, mature enough, wise enough, before they can handle certain truths. The sinister interpretation is that they're maintaining power, that keeping the masses ignorant ensures control, that the initiated remain special, privileged, elevated above others by their access to hidden wisdom. Which is it, or is it both? We may never know. But the pattern is undeniable. Throughout history, there have been individuals who knew more than they said, who hinted at secrets they couldn't reveal, who left cryptic messages for those who came after. Leonardo was one of them, and he wasn't alone. That's not the kind of revelation that gets a warm reception. Religious authorities would resist it because it challenges creation narratives and timelines. Political authorities would resist it because it undermines their claims to legitimacy and progress. Academic authorities would resist it because it invalidates entire fields of study. The truth, if this conspiracy is real, would be profoundly destabilizing, and so it gets buried, ridiculed, dismissed as fantasy. Leonardo becomes a genius, yes, but a safe genius, an individual anomaly, one brilliant mind in a sea of medieval ignorance. We celebrate his art, marvel at his inventions, and carefully avoid asking the harder questions, like, where did he really learn all of this? Who taught him? What did he know that we still don't? The genius narrative is comfortable. It doesn't threaten anything. It confirms our belief in human potential, in individual achievement, in the gradual march of progress. But what if Leonardo's genius wasn't individual at all? What if it was inherited, transmitted, part of a vast underground river of knowledge that flows beneath the surface of recorded history, occasionally breaking through in the work of people like him? That's a much more unsettling story, and perhaps that's exactly why it's been suppressed. Chapter 11, The Others Who Knew. Leonardo wasn't the only Renaissance figure with impossible knowledge. He had contemporaries and successors who displayed similar patterns, knowledge that shouldn't exist, abilities that can't be explained, secrets encoded in their work. Take Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect who designed the dome of Florence Cathedral. Completed in 1436, this dome was an engineering marvel. It was the largest dome built since antiquity, and Brunelleschi achieved it using techniques that baffled his contemporaries. He used a double shell design, with an inner and outer dome separated by a gap. He employed herringbone brick patterns that distributed weight in ways Roman engineers would have recognised, but medieval builders had forgotten. He built the dome without scaffolding, using a self-supporting structure that seemed to defy gravity. How did Brunelleschi know how to do this? The official story is that he studied ancient Roman buildings, particularly the Pantheon in Rome, and figured out their construction methods through observation and experimentation. But here's the thing, the Pantheon's construction techniques were lost. The Romans used concrete formulas that medieval Europe didn't possess. The engineering knowledge required to build such structures had vanished. Yet Brunelleschi rediscovered it. Or did he? What if he had access to Roman texts that described these methods? Texts that weren't supposed to exist. Leonardo knew Brunelleschi's work. They were both in Florence, and Leonardo studied the dome extensively. Did Brunelleschi pass something on to Leonardo? Did they share access to the same sources? Then there's Nikola Tesla, much later, but worth mentioning for the parallels. Tesla, working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, invented alternating current, wireless communication, and designs for energy transmission that are still not fully understood. Tesla claimed his ideas came to him in visions, that he would see complete functional devices in his mind and simply record them. He rarely built prototypes, working almost entirely from mental imagery. Sound familiar? Leonardo also claimed to work from vision, from inspiration, from sources he couldn't fully explain. Tesla died in 1943. When he died, the FBI raided his hotel room and confiscated all his papers. Many of those papers have never been released. To this day, portions of Tesla's work remain classified. Why? What did Tesla know? What was he working on that the government deemed too dangerous to share? The pattern repeats. Individuals throughout history who possess knowledge beyond their time, who leave cryptic notes, who hint at secrets they can't fully reveal, who die with their most important work unfinished or suppressed. Are these isolated geniuses, or are they part of something connected? A chain of knowledge keepers stretching across centuries. Even Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, had secrets. Newton spent decades studying alchemy, writing more about transmutation and mystical philosophy than about gravity and motion. He believed in hidden knowledge, in ancient wisdom encoded in biblical texts and hermetic writings. When Newton died, his alchemical manuscripts were deemed too embarrassing for a man of science and were hidden away. They weren't seriously studied until the 20th century. What was Newton looking for in those texts? What did he think the ancients knew? The conspiracy theory suggests that all of these figures, Leonardo, Brunelleschi, Newton, Tesla and others, were tapping into the same source. A body of ancient knowledge preserved through secret traditions, accessible to those who knew where to look and who to ask. If that's true, the implications are extraordinary. It means human knowledge isn't linear. It means we've lost more than we've gained. It means the ancients might have understood reality in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. And it means Leonardo's notebooks aren't anomalies. They're pieces of a much larger puzzle. Epilogue. The last question. Leonardo da Vinci once wrote, "Learning never exhausts the mind." It's a simple statement, optimistic, encouraging, the kind of thing you'd expect from someone who dedicated his life to understanding the world. But in the context of everything we've discussed tonight, it takes on a different meaning. What if Leonardo wasn't talking about learning as discovery? What if he was talking about learning as remembering? As reconnecting with knowledge that already exists, has always existed, waiting to be accessed by those capable of seeing it. Learning never exhausts the mind because the knowledge is already there, inside us, part of our heritage. We just have to remember. Leonardo may not have been ahead of his time at all. He may have been perfectly on time for a much longer timeline than we acknowledge. A timeline that includes rises and falls, golden ages and dark ages, civilizations that climbed to extraordinary heights and then collapsed, leaving behind only fragments. And maybe, just maybe, people like Leonardo are the ones who find those fragments, who piece together what was lost, who carry the torch through the darkness until humanity is ready to see clearly again. We celebrate Leonardo as an individual genius because that's a story we can accept. It doesn't challenge our worldview, it doesn't force us to reconsider everything we think we know about history. But the evidence suggests something else, something older, something hidden. Leonardo da Vinci had access to knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. He recorded it in code, he kept it secret, and when he died, much of it vanished. That's not the pattern of a lone genius. That's the pattern of a guardian, someone protecting something precious, something dangerous. The question we're left with is this. If Leonardo was preserving ancient knowledge, who else has done the same? How much of human achievement is actually human remembering? And what are we still forgetting? The notebooks that survive offer clues, but they're incomplete. Fragments of a larger truth that Leonardo took to his grave. Perhaps one day the missing pieces will surface, the lost manuscripts will be found, the full story will finally be told. Until then, we're left with mystery, with possibility, with the unsettling suggestion that everything we think we know about our past might be wrong. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't just a Renaissance man. He was a bridge, a connection to something we've lost, a reminder that human potential extends far beyond what we're willing to acknowledge. And if that makes you uncomfortable, if that challenges your understanding of reality, well, maybe that's exactly what Leonardo intended, because the truth isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it's hidden, encoded, waiting in mirror writing for someone brave enough to hold it up to the light. The question is, are you ready to see what's really there? There's one final detail worth mentioning. In Leonardo's very last notebook entry, written shortly before he died, he wrote something strange, something that doesn't fit with anything else in his work. He wrote, "We must continue what was begun so long ago." Continue what? Begun by whom? Leonardo never explained. And then he died. Those words have puzzled scholars for centuries. They don't refer to any specific project. They don't connect to any known commission or artwork. Unless Leonardo was talking about something else entirely, something bigger than any single project. A mission, a purpose, a sacred duty passed down through generations, to preserve what must not be lost, to remember what others have forgotten, to keep the light burning through the darkness. Leonardo fulfilled his part. He recorded what he could. He hid what he must. He left clues for those who would come after. Now it's up to us to decide what to do with them, to see what Leonardo saw, to ask the questions he couldn't ask openly, to continue what was begun so long ago. Sleep well. And remember, learning never exhausts the mind. It only reveals how much we've forgotten. And sometimes, just sometimes, it helps us remember what we never knew we knew. Before we dive into one of the most fascinating rabbit holes in music history, a huge thank you to Javiera for suggesting this topic. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the mystery that captivated millions, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow more than you possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories like this one. Also, if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone tunes in from around the globe. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Now, let's get into a story that changed everything we thought we knew about the most famous band in history. Intro. The tapes that started everything, October 19th, 1969, past midnight. The city of Detroit sleeps under a cold autumn sky, but inside the WKNR radio station, the lights are still burning. A college student named Tom Zarski sits in his dorm room, phone receiver pressed to his ear, waiting for the right moment to make a call that will change popular culture forever. On the other end, DJ Russ Gibb is taking requests, playing deep cuts for the night owls and insomniacs. His voice crackles through transistor radios across the city, warm and familiar. He's done this show 1,000 times, nothing unusual, nothing strange, until Tom Zarsky gets through. "Play Revolution number 9 backwards," Zarsky says. His voice is steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who's discovered something they can't unknow. "Listen carefully. Paul is dead." Gibb laughs it off at first. He's heard conspiracy theories before, every DJ has. Moon landing hoaxes, government cover-ups, the usual late-night paranoia. But something in the caller's tone makes him curious. There's no hysteria in Zarsky's voice, no excitement, just a flat, unsettling certainty. "You're serious?" Gibb asks. "I've listened to it 50 times, Zarsky replies. "Play it backwards, you'll hear it too." Gibb has the White Album right there in the studio. He cues up the track, plays it in reverse over the airwaves. The tape spools backward, creating that eerie underwater quality that reversed audio always has. Through the static and distortion, through the experimental chaos that John Lennon had created, listeners across Detroit hear what sounds like a voice repeating, over and over, "Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man." The phone lines explode. Within minutes, Gibb's switchboard is lighting up like a Christmas tree. Everyone wants to talk about it. Everyone has heard something. Someone mentions the Abbey Road cover. Someone else brings up the flowers on Sgt. Pepper. By the time the sun rises, the story is spreading beyond Detroit, beyond Michigan, racing across the country like wildfire. Within 48 hours, the story explodes across America. Students gather in dorm rooms playing Beatles records backwards on cheap turntables. They huddle around speakers, listening for hidden messages in the run-out grooves. Newspapers print conspiracy guides with illustrations showing the clues. Radio stations dedicate entire segments to analysing album covers and lyrics. Record stores sell out of Beatles albums as people rush to investigate for themselves. The question on everyone's lips: did Paul McCartney really die in 1966 and get replaced by a lookalike? Life magazine runs a cover story. The article is meant to debunk the conspiracy, but it has the opposite effect. By laying out all the clues in one place, it gives the theory legitimacy. Paul McCartney himself is photographed for the magazine on his farm in Scotland, very much alive. But even that doesn't stop the speculation. Some people say the photos prove it's a different person. Some say the timing is too convenient. Some say Paul looks wrong somehow, in ways they can't quite articulate. Most people dismissed it as a hoax, a publicity stunt or mass hysteria. The Beatles themselves offered vague denials and cryptic comments that seemed designed to fuel the fire rather than extinguish it. The story eventually faded from the headlines as new scandals and new music captured public attention. Life moved on, as life always does, but not everyone moved on. In college libraries and basement archives, in private collections and forgotten storage units, people kept investigating. They catalogued every clue, every anomaly, every strange coincidence. They compared photographs with magnifying glasses. They analysed lyrics like biblical scholars studying sacred texts. They wrote letters to each other, forming networks of believers who knew, absolutely knew, that something had happened in 1966. Something the world needed to understand. Adrian Keller certainly didn't. A music journalist in his early 40s, Adrian had spent 2 decades writing about rock history for publications that barely paid the bills. He had interviewed countless musicians, covered reunion tours, written liner notes for reissues that 5 people would actually read. He'd become the kind of journalist who knew everything about music history, but had never broken a major story, never uncovered anything that mattered. His apartment in Brooklyn was filled with vinyl records, filing cabinets stuffed with interview transcripts, and a growing sense that his career had plateaued somewhere around mediocre. He'd pitched the big magazines 100 times. They always said the same thing. We're looking for something new, something fresh, something we haven't heard before. Adrian had tackled almost every rock mystery except one. The Paul is dead theory seemed too ridiculous, too thoroughly debunked, Too much like the kind of thing that would make serious journalists laugh him out of the room. Every time he considered it, he talked himself out of it. There was nothing there. It was a hoax, a prank, mass delusion. Then, in the summer of 2023, Adrian received an email that changed everything. It arrived at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The sender's address was a random string of numbers and letters at an encrypted email service. No name, no subject line. The message was brief. You write about music history. You should know the truth about November 66. I have documents from Apple Corps that have never been made public. Documents that prove the replacement was real. This is not a hoax. Check the attachment. If you want to see the rest, you'll need to prove you're serious about investigating. Adrian thought it was spam. He'd gotten 1,000 emails like this over the years. Secret documents, inside information, proof of conspiracies. They were always fake, always trying to sell him something or waste his time. He almost deleted it. His mouse hovered over the trash icon. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the specific date mentioned, November 66. Maybe it was the mention of Apple Corps, the Beatles company, which wasn't the kind of detail casual hoaxes usually included. Maybe it was just that it was 3 a.m. and he couldn't sleep anyway. He clicked the attachment. What he saw made his hands shake. It was a photograph of what appeared to be an internal memo from Apple Corps, dated December the 7th, 1966. The letterhead looked authentic, the paper quality visible even in the scan, showing the yellowing and aging you'd expect from a document nearly 60 years old. The memo was addressed to Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, from someone whose signature was illegible. The visible text read, "Regarding the arrangement discussed, all parties have agreed to the terms. WC has been briefed and is prepared to begin the transition on December 15th. Studio time has been booked under the cover of experimental sessions. Legal documentation is being prepared by separate counsel to ensure complete discretion. Estimated timeline for full integration, 6 to 8 months. WC William Campbell." Adrian read it 5 times. He zoomed in on every detail, the paper grain, the typewriter font which matched IBM Selectrix common in the 1960s, the letterhead design which he cross-referenced against authenticated Apple Corps documents from that era. Everything looked right. But it could still be a fake. Forgery technology had gotten incredibly sophisticated. Anyone with Photoshop skills and historical knowledge could create a convincing-looking document. The email included one more line. "This is one page of 73. Prove you're a real investigator, not a debunker looking to mock this, and you'll get the rest. Start by finding what happened to Mal Evans' diaries. When you discover where the missing pages are, contact me with proof. Then we'll talk." Adrian spent the rest of that night staring at the document. By morning, he'd made a decision. He would investigate this properly, seriously, with the same rigour he'd bring to any historical research. Not as a believer trying to prove a conspiracy, not as a skeptic trying to debunk nonsense, just as a journalist following evidence wherever it led. If it turned out to be nothing, fine. He'd write an article about how conspiracy theories persist despite evidence, about the psychology of belief, about how easy it is to create convincing forgeries in the digital age. But if there was something real here, something that had been hidden for over 50 years, then maybe this was the story that would finally make his career mean something. He had no idea, sitting there in his Brooklyn apartment as dawn broke over the East River, that the investigation would consume the next 18 months of his life, that it would take him to London, Liverpool, Los Angeles and Edinburgh, that it would introduce him to people who'd been carrying secrets for decades, that it would make him question everything he thought he knew about truth, identity, and the nature of reality itself. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he felt like he was onto something that mattered. Act 1. The official history. Adrian's investigation began where all good research begins, with the established facts. He needed to understand the context, the world the Beatles inhabited in 1966, before he could understand what might have happened that November. The Beatles in 1966 were at the absolute peak of their fame, but that peak was also a kind of prison. They'd conquered America, revolutionised popular music, and become the most recognisable faces on Earth. Everywhere they went, thousands of people screamed. They couldn't walk down a street, couldn't eat in a restaurant, couldn't live anything resembling normal lives. The touring had become unbearable. At concerts, screaming fans drowned out the music so completely that the band couldn't even hear themselves play. They'd stopped trying to perform well and just went through the motions, knowing no one could hear them anyway. Death threats arrived regularly at their hotels and offices. Religious groups organised record-burning ceremonies. The band could barely hear themselves think, let alone play. John Lennon had sparked international outrage by saying the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, a comment that led to organised protests and bonfires of Beatles merchandise across the American South. Radio stations banned their music. The Ku Klux Klan made threats. The band received letters describing in detail how they would be assassinated. Every concert became a security nightmare. Behind the scenes, tensions within the band were rising like pressure in a sealed container. Paul McCartney, the charming bassist with the boyish face and natural diplomatic skills, had increasingly taken on a leadership role that rankled the others. He pushed them harder in the studio, arriving early and staying late. He had strong opinions about every arrangement, every production choice, every creative decision. Some saw it as creative drive and necessary discipline. Others saw it as control and ego. George Harrison was growing resentful of being treated as a junior member despite his developing songwriting talents. He wanted more of his songs on albums. He wanted his musical ideas taken seriously. He was studying Indian music and philosophy, expanding his consciousness in ways that made the endless touring seem even more meaningless. Ringo Starr, the steady anchor of the band, felt the strain too. He was the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts, but even his patience was wearing thin. The band that had once been four friends united against the world was becoming four individuals pulling in different directions. On August 29th, 1966, the Beatles performed their final live concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. The decision to quit touring had been building for months, but this was the moment it became real. 33 minutes of music before 25,000 fans. The last time the Beatles would ever perform together in front of a live audience as a working band. After the final note, they walked off the stage and into their armoured car. George reportedly said, "Well, that's it. I'm not a Beatle anymore." The others laughed, but there was truth in the joke. Something had ended that night. Something died. The decision to quit touring was mutual, but Paul seemed particularly affected by it. He'd always loved performing live, feeding off the energy of crowds, even when that energy became overwhelming. The studio was necessary, but the stage was where he came alive. Adrian interviewed Jeffrey Hampton, a Beatles historian who'd written extensively about this period. Jeffrey had spent decades researching the band's movements during 1966, tracking them through newspaper reports, fan accounts, and eyewitness testimonies. He'd assembled a timeline of their activities that was probably more detailed than the Beatles' own memories. Paul was isolated during this time, Jeffrey explained during their video call. His office was visible behind him, walls covered with Beatles memorabilia and framed photographs. After the touring stopped, the other Beatles went off to do their own things. John went to Spain to film How I Won the War with director Richard Lester. He came back with the round glasses that would become his signature look. George went to India to study sitar with Ravi Shankar, diving deep into Eastern philosophy. Ringo spent time with his family trying to have something resembling a normal life. But Paul, he stayed in London. He rattled around that big city alone. Jeffrey pulled up photographs on his screen, showing Paul at various London locations in October and November of '66. He was spotted at clubs, at art galleries, at avant-garde theatre performances. He was searching for something, some new direction. But friends said he seemed lost. The routine of being a Beatle had structured his entire adult life. Without it, he didn't know who he was. "I've read accounts that he drove around alone at night," Adrian said. "Fast. Dangerously fast." Jeffrey nodded slowly. According to people who knew him, Paul would get into his Aston Martin late at night and just drive. Through the empty streets of London, out into the countryside. He'd drive at speeds that terrified passengers when he had them. People said it was like he was trying to outrun something, or maybe trying to feel something other than the emptiness. "Why would he do that?" Adrian asked. Depression maybe, loss of purpose. The Beatles had been his entire identity since he was barely out of his teens. Suddenly that identity was fragmenting. The band was drifting apart. He could feel it happening and couldn't stop it. Or maybe he just needed to feel something other than the pressure, the expectations, the weight of being Paul McCartney. Fame at that level, it wasn't normal. It isn't normal. None of them were equipped to handle it psychologically. They were just working-class kids from Liverpool who'd gotten bigger than Elvis, bigger than anyone. How do you process that? Geoffrey paused, considering his words carefully. There's a psychological concept called dissociation. When the pressure becomes too much, the mind separates from itself as a protection mechanism. You start to feel like you're watching your own life from outside your body. Several people who knew Paul during this period said he seemed disconnected, like he was going through the motions of being himself but wasn't really present. He pulled up a newspaper clipping on his screen, enlarging it so Adrian could see. Here's something interesting. November 9th, 1966. A small item in the London Evening Standard about a traffic accident involving a well-known musician. The details were vague. The paper said the individual was taken to hospital but released. No name given. The story was pulled from later editions. The official explanation was that it was a false report, a case of mistaken identity. Adrian leaned closer to his own screen. But you don't think it was false? Geoffrey's expression was carefully neutral. I think something happened that night. Whether it was Paul or someone else, whether it was serious or minor, I can't say with certainty. But the timing is remarkable, because just a few weeks later the Beatles started behaving very differently. They went into the studio in late November to begin work on what would become Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And the music they made was unlike anything they'd done before. It was Paul who pushed for the concept of becoming a different band, of creating alter egos, almost like he needed to become someone else to continue being himself. The alleged death. According to the conspiracy theory, Paul McCartney died on November 9th, 1966, in a car crash. The story goes that he'd stormed out of a recording session after an argument, jumped into his Aston Martin, and drove recklessly through the rain-slicked streets of London. He picked up a hitchhiker, got distracted, and crashed. The impact was so severe that the body was barely recognisable. The other Beatles, along with their manager Brian Epstein and record label executives, made a decision. They would cover it up. The band was too valuable to lose. Millions of fans around the world might react with grief so intense it could lead to copycat suicides. The British economy depended on Beatles exports. The cultural impact would be devastating. So they held a secret contest to find a replacement. Someone who looked like Paul, sounded like Paul, could play like Paul. And they found him. Adrian knew this sounded absurd, but as he dug deeper, he found elements that weren't as easily dismissed as he'd expected. Act 2. The Replacement. The man allegedly chosen to replace Paul was named William Shears Campbell, though some versions of the story called him William Shepherd. According to the theory, he was a Scottish musician who bore an uncanny resemblance to McCartney. He'd won a Paul McCartney look-alike contest in Edinburgh in 1965. Adrian researched this detail and found something surprising. The Beatles really did hold look-alike contests in the early 1960s. There were photographs, newspaper announcements, everything. It had been a promotional gimmick, a way to build hype. Winners got to meet the band. Could one of those winners have been groomed as a potential replacement? It seemed far-fetched. But Adrian had to admit it wasn't impossible. He started examining photographs of Paul from before and after, late 1966. He spent weeks going through archives, fan photos, professional shoots, candid snapshots. And he began to notice things. The jawline seemed subtly different. Pre-66, Paul had a slightly softer face. Post-67, Paul looked more angular. The ears appeared to be shaped differently, though this could be explained by camera angles and aging. Height comparisons from concert footage suggested Paul might have grown about 2 inches between 1966 and 1968, which would be unusual for a man in his mid-20s. Most intriguingly, Paul's bass-playing technique seemed to evolve dramatically. Early Beatles footage showed him playing exclusively right-handed. Later footage showed ambidextrous tendencies, switching hand positions that professional bass players found unusual. Adrian contacted forensic experts who specialised in facial recognition. He sent them carefully selected photos from before and after the alleged death date, without telling them the context. The response was cautious but interesting. The bone structure appears consistent, one expert wrote, but there are soft tissue changes that seem atypical for natural aging over this time period. Possible explanations include weight fluctuation, dental work, or yes, different individuals. Then Adrian found something that made him sit up straight in his chair, a reference to a 1970 study conducted at Michigan State University. Researchers there had performed voice print analysis on early and late Beatles recordings, comparing Paul's voice from 1964 to 1969. Their conclusion, buried in an obscure academic journal, significant differences suggest either extreme vocal coaching or two different speakers. Adrian tracked down the original researcher, now in his 80s, and living in a nursing home in Ann Arbor. The man's name was Lawrence Bender, and when Adrian called him, there was a long pause after Adrian explained why he was calling. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me about that for 50 years, Lawrence said quietly. We made our findings very clear. The voice was not the same, but no one wanted to hear it. We were ridiculed, dismissed as cranks. The university stopped funding our research. I learned not to talk about it." "Do you still have the original recordings? The analysis data?" Another pause. "I kept everything. I knew someday it would matter." Act 3. The clues in the music. If there was a cover-up, the conspiracy theorists argued, the Beatles left clues everywhere, whether out of guilt, artistic rebellion, or a desire to tell the truth indirectly. They embedded hints in their music and album artwork. Adrian decided to examine the most famous examples, starting with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released June 1st, 1967. This was the first album recorded entirely after the alleged death, and from the very first notes, it announced itself as something different, something new. The album opens with the sound of an audience murmuring, musicians tuning instruments, and then an explosion of brass and drums. The Beatles are introducing themselves, but not as themselves. They're pretending to be someone else, a fictional band from another time. Why would they do this? Why the elaborate costume, the theatrical conceit? The second track explicitly introduces Billy Shears by name. The lyrics are sung by Ringo, warm and welcoming. "So let me introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears." And then Paul's voice comes in singing "With a little help from my friends." Billy Shears, William Shears Campbell, the supposed replacement's name, right there in the lyrics for everyone to hear. The conspiracy theorists claimed this was the Beatles announcing the replacement, hiding the truth in plain sight, where it could never be proven but never be completely denied. Adrian listened to the song 50 times, listening to Paul's voice, trying to hear if it sounded different from earlier recordings. Was there something changed in the tone, the phrasing, the emotional quality? Or was he hearing differences because he was looking for them? He consulted with the audio engineers who specialised in voice analysis. They created spectrograms of Paul's vocals from 1965 compared to Sgt. Pepper. The patterns were similar, but there were differences. Some frequencies that appeared stronger in the later recordings, some resonances that seemed altered. Could be different microphones, one engineer said. Could be the studio at Abbey Road versus earlier recording locations. Could be vocal coaching or technique evolution. Or yes, could be different voices that are very similar. The album cover itself was a work of art, designed by Peter Blake and photographed by Michael Cooper. It showed the Beatles in colourful marching band uniforms standing in front of a crowd of cardboard cutouts of famous people. It was supposed to represent the Lonely Hearts Club Band, performing for an audience of their heroes and influences. Adrian obtained the highest resolution scan he could find of the original cover. He zoomed in on every detail, studying it pixel by pixel. The crowd included Marilyn Monroe, Bob Dylan, Edgar Allan Poe, Karl Marx, Oscar Wilde, and dozens of others. A strange mix of actors, writers, philosophers, and historical figures. But at the Beatles' feet, arranged in flowers, was something that made Adrian's skin prickle. A floral arrangement that appeared to spell out Paul in yellow chrysanthemums. The letters weren't perfectly formed, but the intention seemed clear. The question mark was particularly distinct. Adrian contacted horticultural experts to ask if the flowers could have been arranged that way by accident. They all said the same thing. Flower arrangements at this scale are designed carefully. Every bloom is placed intentionally. If it looks like letters, someone meant it to look like letters. He found interviews with Peter Blake from years later. Blake was asked about the flowers spelling Paul. His response was carefully neutral. We put many symbols and messages into that cover. Some were obvious, some were subtle. People see what they're meant to see. What they're meant to see. Not what's there by accident, but what they're meant to see. Above Paul's head in the photograph, a hand was positioned in an unusual gesture. Adrian researched symbolic gestures across different cultures and found that in several traditions, a hand held above someone's head in this specific position was associated with death, blessing the deceased, or marking someone for burial. The more Adrian studied the Sgt. Pepper cover, the more deliberate everything seemed. The Beatles were dressed in bright, elaborate uniforms, but Paul's uniform was slightly different from the others. He wore an arm patch that the others didn't have. The patch read OPD, which conspiracy theorists claimed stood for Officially Pronounced Dead. Others argued it was actually OPP, standing for Ontario Provincial Police, and the patch was just a random piece of decoration. Adrian found the original uniform in the Beatles' archives. The patch definitely existed. Whether it said OPD or OPP was debatable depending on the angle and lighting. But why would Paul's uniform be the only one with this particular detail? He studied the expressions on the Beatles' faces in the cover photo. John looked enigmatic, his expression unreadable behind his moustache. George looked serene, almost meditative. Ringo looked cheerful, friendly. Paul looked distant, almost sad, despite the colourful surroundings. His eyes seemed focused somewhere else, somewhere beyond the camera. On the back cover of the album, Paul was the only Beatle facing away from the camera. His back was to the viewer, while the other three faced forward. Another coincidence? Another random artistic choice? Adrian counted the coincidences. The name Billy Shears, the flowers spelling Paul, the hand gesture above Paul's head, the OPD patch, Paul facing away on the back cover. Each one individually could be dismissed, but together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. He found something else on the back cover. In the lyrics printed there, one line from Within You Without You was highlighted. We were talking about the space between us all. Space between us all. The space created by loss, by absence, by someone who should be there but isn't. Adrian visited Abbey Road Studios, the place where Sgt. Pepper was recorded. The studio had been preserved as much as possible, a museum to the Beatles' creative process. He stood in Studio 2, where most of the album was recorded, trying to imagine what it had been like in early 1967. The engineer who'd worked on Sgt. Pepper was Geoff Emerick, who'd written a memoir about his time with the Beatles. Adrian read it cover to cover, looking for clues. Emerick described Paul as being incredibly focused during these sessions, arriving early and staying late, obsessing over every detail. He described Paul taking on more and more of the creative leadership, sometimes to the frustration of the others. But Emerick also noted something strange. He wrote that Paul seemed different during these sessions, not in his musical ability, which was stronger than ever, but in his personality. He was more intense, more driven, less playful than he'd been in earlier years. Emerick attributed this to the natural evolution of someone maturing and taking on more responsibility. Or was it something else? Was it the behaviour of someone desperately trying to prove themselves, to fill shoes that might have belonged to someone else? Then there was Magical Mystery Tour, released November 19th, 1967. The album booklet contained dozens of photographs. In one colour spread showing all four Beatles, 3 wore bright colours. Paul wore all black. In photo after photo, Paul appeared separated from the others, isolated, marked as different. The song I Am the Walrus contained a line that sounded like John Lennon singing I Buried Paul. Lennon later claimed he was actually singing Cranberry Sauce, and if you listened carefully, that explanation was plausible. But the ambiguity felt intentional. Adrian contacted Giles Martin, son of the legendary Beatles producer George Martin, who'd worked on remixing and remastering Beatles tracks. Giles agreed to a brief phone conversation. "Look, I've heard every theory," Giles said. "My father heard them all too. He always said the same thing. The Beatles were artists who enjoyed messing with people's heads. They loved inserting little jokes and references that only they understood. Does that mean Paul died? No. Does it mean they deliberately planted clues to make people think he did? Possibly. What did your father think about the voice analysis studies?" Adrian asked. There was a pause. "My father never commented on those publicly, but privately. He told me once that Paul's voice changed dramatically in late '66. He attributed it to Paul taking voice lessons and learning to sing in a higher register. Whether that's the full explanation, I don't know." The most famous clue of all appeared on Abbey Road, released September 26, 1969. The cover photograph showed the four Beatles crossing a street in a line. It was a simple image, almost mundane. Photographer Ian Macmillan took it from a stepladder in the middle of the street while a policeman held up traffic. 6 total shots. The whole photo session took about 10 minutes on a warm August morning, but fans immediately interpreted it as a funeral procession, and once you saw it that way, you couldn't unsee it. John Lennon, dressed in white, represented a preacher or religious figure leading a funeral. Ringo Starr, dressed in black, represented an undertaker or mourner. Paul McCartney, wearing a suit but barefoot and holding a cigarette in his right hand, represented a corpse. In many cultures, the dead are buried barefoot. Paul was also out of step with the other three, his right foot forward, while theirs were left foot forward. George Harrison, in denim, represented a gravedigger dressed for manual labour. Adrian had seen the image 1,000 times, but he looked at it now with fresh eyes, studying every detail in high resolution. The composition was eerily perfect for the funeral interpretation. Too perfect to be accidental, but the detail that stopped Adrian's breath entirely was in the background. A white Volkswagen Beetle parked on the left side of the street, its license plate clearly visible, LMW 28RF. Paul McCartney was born June 18, 1942. In 1969, when Abbey Road was released, he was 27 years old. But if he had died in November of '66, as the conspiracy claimed, he would have been 28 in 1969. 28. If he had lived. LMW 20SF. Adrian verified this detail obsessively, because it seemed too perfect, too, on the nose. He found the original photograph in the Abbey Road archives. He examined negatives from the photo session. He tracked down information about Ian Macmillan, the photographer, who had died in 2006 but left behind extensive notes about his work with the Beatles. The car was real. The plate was real. The photograph was taken in August of '69, before digital manipulation existed, before Photoshop, before any technology that could seamlessly alter an image. The license plate really did say 28IF exactly as it appeared. Adrian contacted automotive historians in Britain to understand how license plates were assigned in the '60s. The system was regional, with letters and numbers assigned somewhat randomly based on registration location and date. The chances of a car with this specific plate happening to be parked at this specific location at this specific time, during a photo session for a Beatles album that happened to be interpreted as a funeral, were astronomical. He found an interview with the car's owner from the 1980s. A woman who'd lived on Abbey Road said she'd owned the Beetle for years and parked it on her street every day. She'd had no idea the Beatles were taking photographs that morning. When she found out later that her car was in the iconic image, she was thrilled. But she'd eventually sold the car because Beatles fans kept vandalising it, trying to steal the license plate as a souvenir. Did anyone from the Beatles management ever contact you about moving your car for the photo session? Adrian saw in a transcript of the interview. No, never, the woman had replied. It was just a coincidence that it was there, though I always thought it was funny, the plate number. My husband noticed it right away when the album came out. He said, "Look, Paul would be 28 if he'd lived." We laughed about it. A coincidence, that's what everyone said. Just a random car that happened to be parked in the background. Pure chance. But Adrian kept thinking about the odds, the specific age, the IF phrasing, the placement in the background, perfectly visible but not obtrusive. If you were planning a conspiracy, if you were leaving clues, this is exactly how you do it. Subtle enough to maintain deniability, specific enough to be unmistakable once you saw it. He dug deeper into the Abbey Road photo session, found outtakes from the other 5 shots Macmillan had taken. In some, the Volkswagen wasn't visible. In others, it was partially obscured. Only this one shot, the one chosen for the album cover, showed the license plate clearly. The Beatles had final approval on all album artwork. They'd reviewed all 6 photographs and chosen this one. Paul himself had been part of that decision. If the license plate was problematic, if it was a coincidence that looked too much like a conspiracy clue, they could have chosen a different shot. They could have asked Macmillan to crop the image. They could have had the photo retouched to blur the plate. They did none of those things. They chose the shot where 20SIF was clearly visible, and they released it to the world without comment or explanation. Adrian found something else interesting. In late '69, just after Abbey Road was released and the Paul is Dead conspiracy was reaching its peak, someone from Apple Corps had contacted the owner of the Volkswagen, not to ask her to move it or hide it, but to offer to buy it from her. She'd refused. Years later, when she finally sold the car to another private buyer, it eventually ended up at a Volkswagen dealership that restored it. Eventually, in 2015, it sold at auction for over $100,000. Just a random car. Just a coincidence. Just a license plate that happened to encode the exact message conspiracy theorists were looking for. Adrian stared at the image for hours, trying to see it as an accident, trying to convince himself it meant nothing. He couldn't do it. Act 4. The people who talked. If a cover-up had occurred, someone would have talked eventually. Someone always talks. Adrian started looking for insiders who might have known the truth. The first name that kept appearing in his research was Mal Evans. Evans had been the Beatles' road manager and closest confidant. He was there for everything, knew all their secrets, travelled with them constantly. After the Beatles broke up, Evans struggled. He drank heavily, had trouble finding work, seemed haunted by something. In January of 1976, Evans was shot and killed by police in Los Angeles. The official story was that he was drunk, waving an air rifle, and refused to put it down. Friends said it felt like suicide by cop. He'd been severely depressed. But here's what made Adrian's investigation take a darker turn. Mal Evans had been keeping diaries for years, detailed journals about his time with the Beatles. After his death, those diaries disappeared. His family never got them back. They were supposedly seized as evidence and then lost in the Los Angeles Police Department archives. Adrian filed Freedom of Information requests. He contacted Evans's surviving family members. He traced the chain of custody for the diaries through old police records, and he found something stunning. Pages from the diaries had surfaced decades later in the possession of a private collector. Just fragments, maybe 30 pages total. The collector refused to sell, but agreed to let Adrian examine them under supervision. The entries were mundane mostly, notes about travel schedules and equipment problems. But there were strange passages too. One entry from November of '66 read, "Couldn't sleep. Keep thinking about the decision. Nothing will ever be the same. How do we live with this?" Another entry from December of '66. "The new arrangement is working better than expected. No one suspects, but I suspect everything now. I see it in their eyes." And one final entry that made Adrian's heart race. "Paul, whoever he is now, seems happy with the deception. Or maybe he's just better at hiding it than the rest of us. Whoever he is now." Adrian tried to verify the handwriting, comparing it to authenticated Mal Evans documents. The analysis came back positive. The pages were genuine. Then there was Ringo Starr. In 2011, a fake interview circulated online, claiming Ringo had finally admitted Paul died and was replaced. The interview was quickly debunked as a hoax. Ringo himself denied it. But the fake interview had been convincing enough that major news outlets initially reported it as real. Adrian found something interesting while researching Ringo's public statements over the decades. Whenever interviewers brought up the Paul is dead conspiracy, Ringo would get uncomfortable. He'd make jokes to deflect. He'd change the subject. He never engaged with it directly. Adrian contacted a former Apple Corps employee named Margaret Hastings, who'd worked as an assistant in the 1970s. Margaret was in her 80s now, living in Brighton, and she agreed to meet Adrian at a seaside cafe. Ringo was different than the others, Margaret said, stirring her tea. Quieter, more observant. I remember once in '74, a journalist asked him about the death conspiracy during an interview. Ringo just stood up and walked out, didn't say a word. The interview never aired. Did he ever talk to you about it? Once. We were alone in an office going over some paperwork. He looked at me and said, "Margaret, do you ever wonder if we did the right thing?" I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head and said, "Nothing. Forget I said anything." What do you think he meant? Margaret looked out at the grey ocean. I think they made a choice back in '66 that they've had to live with ever since. What that choice was exactly, I can't say, but it weighed on Ringo. You could see it. The final piece came from an unexpected source. Heather Mills, Paul McCartney's ex-wife. During their contentious divorce in 2007, Mills had given interviews hinting that Paul was hiding something enormous. "If the public knew what I know about him," she'd said on a talk show, "they would be absolutely shocked. There's a massive secret, and I will take it to my grave." Most people assumed she was talking about financial matters or personal behaviour, but Adrian found the interview and watched it carefully. The way she emphasised what I know about him was strange. Not about their marriage, about him specifically. Adrian managed to get a brief phone call with someone who'd worked as Mill's publicist during the divorce. The publicist, speaking on condition of anonymity, said something chilling. "Heather told me once that Paul wasn't who people thought he was. She said it literally, those exact words. He isn't who people think he is." I asked what she meant. She wouldn't elaborate, but she seemed frightened when she said it. Act 5. Government involvement. The conspiracy took on a darker dimension when Adrian started finding evidence of official interest in keeping the Beatles together at all costs. Declassified British government documents from the 1960s showed that officials viewed the Beatles as crucial to the national economy and international prestige. Beatlemania had become a major export, bringing in millions in tourism and merchandise. The government was deeply invested in the band's success. Adrian found memos from the Home Office discussing the Beatles as essential cultural assets during the Cold War. Britain had lost its empire, lost its dominance, but it had the Beatles. That meant something on the world stage. One partially redacted memo from November of '66 discussed contingency planning for potential disruption to key cultural exports. The specific context was blacked out, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Then Adrian found a connection to MI5, the British intelligence service. A former technical officer named Peter Whitmore had written a memoir in 2012 that mentioned his work on media management in the 1960s. The memoir didn't mention the Beatles by name, but it described techniques for manipulating television footage to protect persons of national importance. Adrian tracked down Whitmore, now living in Scotland. The old man agreed to meet, but seemed nervous about it. "We had ways of altering footage even back then," Whitmore explained. "Frame-by-frame manipulation. It was tedious, took weeks of work. But we could change faces, remove people from scenes, edit conversations. All analogue, all done with optical printers and careful splicing." "Did you ever work on Beatles footage?" Whitmore hesitated. "I worked on many projects. Some I can discuss. Others, well, the Official Secrets Act is still in effect. Even for events from 60 years ago, especially for those, the old secrets are the ones that still matter." But as they talked, Whitmore let slip something revealing. "I will say that I saw interview footage being altered. Someone's face being, let's say, corrected to match earlier appearances. I thought it was odd at the time. I was told it was for continuity purposes. Whose face? Whitmore stood up. This conversation is over. I've said too much already. Adrian dug further into intelligence connections. He found a reference in a declassified CIA document from 1967 about Operation Mongoose, the anti-Castro campaign. Buried in the appendix was a mention of cultural asset coordination with British intelligence services. A handwritten note in the margin listed several names. Most were blacked out, but one was partially visible. McCart, with the rest obscured by redaction. Why would Paul McCartney's name appear in a CIA document about Cuba? It made no sense unless he was considered an asset worth protecting or monitoring. Adrian contacted a retired CIA analyst who specialised in Cold War operations. The analyst, who insisted on anonymity, offered a theory. During the 60s, there was genuine concern about youth culture getting out of control, the analyst said. The counterculture movement, anti-war protests, drug use. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic were worried about social stability. The Beatles were seen as either a threat or a tool, depending on how they behaved. If something happened to threaten their stability, yes, there would have been interest in managing that situation. Managing it how? Whatever was necessary to maintain order. Asset 6. The final pieces. Adrian was deep into his investigation when he received an anonymous package at his apartment. No return address. Inside was a USB drive containing audio files labelled only with dates. The first file was labelled October 4th, 67. Adrian plugged in his headphones and listened. It was studio chatter, the kind of casual conversation that happens between takes. He heard George Harrison tuning his guitar. He heard Ringo talking about lunch, and then he heard John Lennon's voice clear as day. "Billy, start from the top again." There was a pause, then the sound of a bass line starting up. "Billy, that's still not right. Paul used to play it with more bounce." Another pause. "I'm not Paul," said a voice that sounded exactly like Paul McCartney. "You keep forgetting that." "We all forget sometimes," Lennon replied. "That's the problem." Adrian played the clip 20 times, analysing every word. He sent it to audio forensics experts. They confirmed the voices matched authenticated recordings of Lennon and McCartney from that period. The recording was genuine, or an impossibly perfect fake. But there was more on the USB drive. Much more. The second file was labelled November 15th, 66, before Sergeant Pepper, before the supposed replacement would have been fully integrated. Adrian's hands shook as he clicked play. This recording was different. Lower quality, like it had been made on a portable tape recorder rather than professional studio equipment. There were voices in the background, indistinct. Then one voice became clear, speaking in a Liverpool accent that wasn't quite right, slightly off in ways Adrian couldn't immediately identify. "How long do we have to keep doing this?" the voice asked. It sounded like Paul, but also not like Paul, like someone doing an impression. "Until you get it perfect," another voice responded. This one Adrian recognised immediately as George Martin, the Beatles' producer. The way he holds the bass, the way he moves on stage, the way he laughs, every detail matters. You're not just replacing a musician, you're replacing an icon. "What if I can't do it? What if someone notices?" "They won't notice if you're perfect, and you will be perfect, because the alternative is unthinkable. Do you understand? What's at stake here?" A long pause. Then, "I understand." "Good. Let's run through Penny Lane again. Paul wrote this one before the accident. You need to perform it like you wrote it yourself, like it came from your soul, not his." Adrian stopped the recording. His apartment felt too small, too quiet. He walked to the window, looked out at the Brooklyn streets below, trying to process what he'd just heard. If this recording was real, it was proof. Not circumstantial evidence, not coincidences, but actual documentation of a replacement being coached to impersonate Paul McCartney. But how had this recording survived? Who had made it? And why were they giving it to Adrian now, after all these years? He continued through the files on the USB drive. There were dozens of them. spanning from November 66 through early 68. Training sessions, voice coaching, discussion of surgical procedures to perfect the resemblance, references to the original and the replacement spoken casually, as if everyone involved had accepted this bizarre reality. One file from December 66 contained a conversation between Brian Epstein and someone whose voice Adrian didn't recognise. The unknown man had a clipped, official-sounding accent. British intelligence, maybe, or government. The Prime Minister is satisfied with the arrangement, the unknown voice said. As long as the public never learns the truth, this can continue indefinitely. The Beatles are too valuable to lose. And if the truth comes out, Epstein asked. He sounded exhausted, defeated. It won't. We've taken measures to ensure that. Anyone who knows the truth understands the consequences of speaking. The Official Secrets Act applies to all parties involved, including the replacement. Especially the replacement. He's in deeper than anyone. If this collapses, he loses everything. His entire life becomes a fraud. He'll never speak. Adrian sat in darkness, listening to these recordings over and over. If they were real, they changed everything. They proved the conspiracy wasn't just fan speculation or creative interpretation of album clues. It was real, documented, admitted to by the very people who'd orchestrated it. But the recordings also raised a chilling question. Why had someone sent them to him? Who had access to these tapes? And what did they want? 2 days after receiving the USB drive, Adrian got another email from the same encrypted address as before. This one was longer. You now have evidence that would destroy the myth. You could publish these recordings and prove the conspiracy was real. But consider this. The man you know as Paul McCartney has lived this life for over 50 years. He's written songs, raised children, created art, touched millions of lives. Is he less real because he started as a replacement? Is his music less meaningful because it came from a man playing a role? Truth is important, but so is mercy. Think carefully about what you do with this information. Some truths unmake the world. Adrian thought about it. He had the story of a lifetime, evidence that could rewrite music history, proof of the biggest cover-up in entertainment history. But he also thought about the man currently known as Paul McCartney. In his 70s now, still making music, still touring, still being Paul. If he was a replacement, he'd spent more years being Paul McCartney than the original Paul had. At what point does the performance become the reality? This second revelation came from a handwriting analyst Adrian had hired to compare Paul's autographs over the years. The analyst, Catherine Joe, had examined hundreds of signatures from fan merchandise, legal documents, and photographs. Her conclusion was definitive. You're looking at two distinctly different writers. The pre-66 signatures show left-handed pen pressure and certain loop formations. The post-67 signatures show right-handed pressure and different baseline characteristics. These are not variations from mood or aging. These are fundamentally different hands. Paul McCartney was famously left-handed. If the post-66 Paul showed right-handed writing patterns, that was significant. But Catherine had found something even more interesting. She discovered a signature from early 67 during the transitional period. It showed characteristics of both hands, as if someone was practicing writing left-handed but occasionally slipping back into their natural right-handed patterns. This is what it looks like when someone is learning to forge a signature, Catherine explained. They practice the target signature until they can reproduce it automatically. But during the learning phase, you see these hybrid attempts. This signature from February 67 shows exactly that pattern. Adrian looked at the signature she'd highlighted. It was from a legal document authorising Apple Corps expenditures, dated February 7th, 67, right in the middle of when the Sgt. Pepper sessions were happening. The final piece came from the Abbey Road recording logs. Adrian had obtained copies through a contact at EMI. The original session logs from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band listed all the musicians and singers present for each track. Most of the names were familiar. Paul McCartney on bass and vocals, John Lennon on guitar and vocals, George Harrison on lead guitar, Ringo Starr on drums, session musicians for orchestral parts. But on several tracks, There was an additional name listed for background vocals, W. Campbell. Adrian cross-referenced this with later reissues and remasters. In the official credits released from the 1980s onward, W. Campbell's name had been removed, digitally erased from history. He contacted the audio engineer who'd worked on the 1980s remasters. The engineer, now retired, agreed to talk off the record. "I was given a list of credit corrections," the engineer said. "Some names to add, some to remove. W. Campbell was on the removal list. I was told it was an error, someone who'd been listed by mistake. But when I listened to the isolated vocal tracks, I could clearly hear a fifth voice that wasn't any of the four Beatles." "Did you ask about it?" "I learned early in this business not to ask questions about the Beatles. You do the work, you get paid, you forget what you saw." Adrian pressed him. "But you remember what you heard. What did that fifth voice sound like?" The engineer was quiet for a long moment. "It sounded exactly like Paul. That's what made it strange. Why would Paul's voice be credited to someone else unless—" He trailed off. "Unless Paul wasn't Paul," Adrian finished. The engineer didn't confirm or deny, but he didn't have to. Adrian had one more revelation waiting for him, though he didn't know it yet. It would come from the most unexpected source, a former Beatle himself. 3 months into his investigation, Adrian received a call from a blocked number. When he answered, the voice on the other end was instantly recognisable. "This is Ringo Starr," the voice said. "I heard you've been asking questions about 66. We should talk, but not over the phone. Are you free to fly to Los Angeles next week?" Ending. The truth or the lie. Adrian flew to Los Angeles the following Tuesday. He'd been given instructions to meet at a recording studio in Burbank, the kind of anonymous professional space where famous musicians could work without attracting attention. When he arrived, a security guard checked his identification and led him through a maze of corridors to a small lounge area. Ringo Starr was sitting on a couch, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, looking exactly like the photos Adrian had seen, but also somehow more real, more three-dimensional. Age had weathered his face, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "Adrian Keller," Ringo said, standing to shake hands. "The journalist who won't let sleeping Beatles lie." They sat. Ringo offered coffee, which Adrian accepted despite his hands already shaking with adrenaline. This was really happening. He was sitting across from Ringo Starr, about to discuss the biggest conspiracy in music history. "I'll be direct," Ringo said. "You've uncovered things that were meant to stay buried. The USB drive, the recordings. You've got evidence that could change how people see the Beatles forever. And I know you're trying to decide what to do with it." "How did you know about the USB drive?" Adrian asked. Ringo smiled sadly. "Because I'm the one who sent it to you. Not personally, obviously, but I arranged for it to be delivered. Those recordings have been in my possession for over 50 years. Mal Evans gave them to me before he died. He'd been making them secretly, documenting what was happening. He wanted someone to know the truth, but he was too afraid to release them himself." Adrian's mind reeled. Why? Why send them to me? Why? Now? "Because I'm 73 years old," Ringo said. "I've been carrying this secret my entire adult life. John's gone. George is gone. Paul, the one you know as Paul, he's still out there living the lie. And I'm tired. So incredibly tired of pretending." "So it's true? All of it?" Ringo looked at his hands. "Let me tell you what really happened in November of 66. Not the conspiracy theory version. The actual truth." He took a deep breath. "Paul did have a car accident that night. November 9th. He was driving too fast. He was upset after an argument at the studio and he crashed. But he didn't die. He was badly injured, unconscious, in critical condition. We didn't know if he'd survive. And while he was in hospital fighting for his life, Brian Epstein and our management made a decision without telling us." Adrian leaned forward, recording every word on his phone. "They were terrified," Ringo continued. "Terrified that if word got out about the accident, it would destroy the Beatles. We just announced we were quitting touring. The press was already writing that we were falling apart. An accident involving Paul could be the end of everything. So they found someone, a musician named William Campbell, who'd won a lookalike contest, and they started preparing him, just in case." Just in case Paul died? Just in case Paul couldn't continue being Paul? If he survived but was brain damaged, or paralysed, or scarred so badly he couldn't be seen in public? They needed a contingency plan, so they brought in Billy and they started training him intensively. Voice coaching, bass lessons, studying films of Paul's mannerisms. It was supposed to be insurance, nothing more. Ringo stood, walked to the window. Paul survived. After 2 weeks in hospital, he woke up. But he was different. The head injury had changed him. He had memory problems, personality changes. He was Paul, legally and technically, but he wasn't the same Paul, and Billy, the replacement, had been training so hard that in some ways he'd become more Paul than Paul was. "I don't understand," Adrian said. "The management made a decision. They would use both of them. The real Paul would recover in private, relearn who he was, and Billy would be Paul in public, would handle the press, would make appearances. Eventually, they said, Paul would be ready to return. It was just temporary." But it wasn't temporary, Adrian said. No, because something strange happened. Paul, the real Paul, he didn't want to come back. The accident had freed him somehow. He'd spent 6 years being trapped in fame, unable to live a normal life, and now he had a chance to escape. Billy was willing to be Paul McCartney permanently. He loved the music, loved the fame, loved being a Beatle. And Paul, the original, he just wanted peace. Ringo turned back to face Adrian. So we made a devil's bargain. Billy would be Paul in public. The real Paul would get to live quietly, privately, under a different name. And we'd all keep the secret because revealing it would destroy everything we'd built. Where is he now, the real Paul? He died in 2019, heart attack, quietly, in a small town in Scotland, under the name he'd been using for 50 years. A few people attended his funeral. None of them knew he'd once been Paul McCartney. Adrian felt like the room was spinning. And the man we know as Paul? The one still touring, still making records. Billy Campbell? He's been Paul longer than Paul was Paul? He earned the name, he wrote brilliant songs, he lived the life authentically. At what point does the replacement become the real thing? The recordings on the USB drive, the training sessions, the references to the replacement. All real, all documenting what actually happened. I'm giving them to you because the world deserves to know the truth. But I'm also telling you the full story because truth without context is just cruelty. Billy didn't steal Paul's life. He was given it, and he honoured it. He became it. Adrian sat in silence, processing everything. Finally he asked, "Does Billy know you're telling me this?" Ringo shook his head. "He thinks the secret will last forever. Maybe it should. Maybe some lies become more true than truth. I don't know anymore. I just know I needed to tell someone who would understand the complexity of it." After the meeting, Adrian flew back to New York in a daze. He had the story, the evidence, the confirmation from a living Beatle. He could publish it all and become the journalist who solved the greatest mystery in music history. But he kept thinking about Ringo's words. Truth without context is just cruelty. Adrian finished his investigation with 3 clear possibilities, though he now knew which one was closest to truth. Possibility 1. Paul McCartney really died in '66, and the Beatles covered it up using Billy Shears Campbell to save their careers and protect fans. This was the conspiracy theory in its purest form, the version that had circulated for 50 years. Possibility 2. The replacement happened, but it was more complex than a simple cover-up. It was a collaboration between a man who wanted to escape fame and a man who wanted to embrace it. The Beatles, along with government officials, facilitated a switch that served everyone's interests. The clues in the albums were real, deliberate markers of the truth, left by artists who couldn't bring themselves to fully erase what had happened. Possibility 3. None of it was true in the way people thought. Paul evolved, changed, grew. The clues were artistic playfulness. The differences were natural evolution. The whole conspiracy was a myth that grew beyond anyone's control, fed by ambiguity and the human desire to believe in hidden truths. Adrian sat in his apartment, staring at his computer screen where he'd typed out the full story. Title: The Man Who Stopped Living, the true story of Paul McCartney's death and replacement. He had Ringo's testimony, the USB recordings, the handwriting analysis, the studio logs, the photographs, everything needed to prove the conspiracy was real. His finger hovered over the publish button. He thought about Billy Campbell, now in his mid-70s, still touring as Paul McCartney, still making music, still bringing joy to millions. What would happen to him if the truth came out? Would it destroy his legacy? Would it invalidate decades of brilliant work because he'd started as an imposter? He thought about the real Paul, who died quietly in Scotland, having found the peace he desperately needed. Would exposing the truth honour his memory or violate the privacy he'd fought so hard to achieve? He thought about Ringo's exhaustion, the weight of carrying a secret for 50 years. Had Ringo really wanted the truth published, or had he just needed to tell someone, to share the burden without necessarily destroying the myth? Adrian deleted the draft. He titled his final article, "The Man Who Stopped Living, an investigation into music's greatest mystery." He submitted it to a major magazine without the Ringo interview, without the USB recordings, without the definitive proof. He included the clues, the coincidences, the witness statements that were already public. He presented the evidence ambiguously, leaving readers to draw their own conclusions. The magazine rejected it, calling it too speculative. He tried smaller publications, same response. No one wanted to touch it. So Adrian published it himself on a website he created. He uploaded all his public evidence, all his interviews with historians and analysts, all the research that didn't include the secret recordings or Ringo's confession. He expected it to go viral, to reignite the debate. It got modest attention, a few thousand views, some discussion threads online, a couple of YouTube videos analysing his findings, and then, 2 weeks after publication, Adrian received a phone call from a blocked number. "This is Paul McCartney," the voice said. It sounded exactly like Paul McCartney, though Adrian now knew it was Billy Campbell. "I read your article." Adrian's hand shook. "Thank you for calling. I have questions. I'm not going to confirm or deny anything you wrote," the voice continued. "But I will tell you this. The Beatles ended on August 29th, 1966 at Candlestick Park. Everything after that was performance art. The greatest performance art of all time. We became fictional characters playing ourselves. Does it matter which fiction you believe? So you're saying, I'm saying that Paul McCartney, the real one, whoever that was, died the day Beatlemania died. What replaced him? Maybe a better musician. Maybe a government plant. Maybe just a man trying to live up to an impossible image. Maybe all three. Does the distinction matter if the music is good?" There was a pause. "I died in 1966, the voice said quietly. "We all died, and we've been living as ghosts ever since, haunting ourselves." The line went dead. Adrian never published anything about that phone call or his meeting with Ringo. He couldn't prove the conversation with Billy was real, and the truth Ringo had shared felt like a gift that shouldn't be weaponized for clicks and controversy. He kept the USB drive in a safe deposit box. Maybe someday, after Billy died, after enough years had passed that the truth couldn't hurt anyone anymore, someone would find it and publish the recordings. Or maybe not. Maybe some secrets were valuable precisely because they remained secret. What Adrian finally understood was that the Paul is dead conspiracy isn't really about whether Paul died. It's about whether we can ever truly know anyone, even people whose lives are documented and photographed and recorded more thoroughly than anyone in history. It's about how identity itself is a performance, and how sometimes the performance becomes more real than the reality. We all die and get replaced by newer versions of ourselves, over and over, until nothing remains of who we were except photographs and recordings and memories that might be accurate or might be completely wrong. The person you were 10 years ago is gone, dead, in a very real sense. The person you are now is a replacement, carrying forward some elements of the original while changing others. Paul McCartney, whoever he started as, understood this better than anyone. He lived it. He became it. He turned his own existence, or Billy's existence, or their shared existence, into art, into mystery, into a question that would outlive all of them. And in the end, maybe that's immortality. Not living forever, but becoming a question that can never be answered. Becoming a story that people will tell and retell, investigate and debate, believe and doubt, for as long as people listen to music and wonder about the lives behind it. The man who stopped living in 1966 never died at all. He just became something bigger than life. He became a legend, a mystery, a ghost haunting the greatest band that ever was. Whether that man was James Paul McCartney or William Campbell or some synthesis of both doesn't change the fact that the music was real. The impact was real. The joy and meaning millions of people found in those songs was real. Truth is important. Adrian believed that as a journalist. But he'd learned that sometimes truth is less important than kindness, than mercy, than allowing people to keep the illusions that sustain them. Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man. Turn me on, dead man. The words play backwards in the darkness, in the static between stations, in the gap between what we know and what we can never prove, and the mystery endures, perfect and unsolvable, exactly as it should be. Because some secrets are meant to be kept, some deaths are meant to be questioned, some lives are meant to remain forever, uncertain. And some men stop living long before they die, while others begin living only after they've replaced someone who couldn't continue. Adrian closed his laptop. Outside his window, Brooklyn carried on with its endless rhythm. Millions of people living their own mysteries, wearing their own masks, replacing earlier versions of themselves every single day without anyone noticing or caring. The Beatles had just done it more publicly, more artistically, more mysteriously than anyone else, and that perhaps was the whole point.